fast. There we go. Quick introduction to the conference committee. It took a team to put this day together. We're super excited to see it come to fruition. This is the conference committee. You'll hear their voices throughout the day. I'm Renee Barassa, Curtis Delpra, Christy Davis, Mike Nardolilli, Heidi Molt, and Stephanie Newmer. They were all super important in getting all of this together. With that, I will hand it over to Mike Nardolilli. He's the Executive Director of ICPRB.
Thank you, Renee. I am Mike Nardolilli, the Executive Director of the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin, ICPRB. For those of you not familiar with us, we are a congressionally approved compact of all the jurisdictions in the Potomac River Basin. I'd like to welcome all of you to our 2022 Potomac River Conference. We'll be starting off with a poll. How much do you know about PFAS? And while you're doing that, I'll just let you know that I first heard about PFAS when I read the book Troubled Water in 2019 about Teflon manufacturing in Hoosick Falls in upstate New York. Now, there's not a day that goes by that you don't see something in the news about PFAS. For example, last Friday, a judge overseeing the multi-district litigation over firefighting foam struck 3M's government contractor defense. And just this morning, as I was eating breakfast, the local news reported that PFAS have been found in school uniforms. So let's check on the poll results so far. We have 67% with basic knowledge, and then a solid background of a quarter. And completely green, only about 5%. So I think we have a very sophisticated audience as we've anticipated. To make the transition between speakers as soon as possible, I would like to introduce our two session one speakers at the same time. We are pleased to have Zach Schafer as our keynote speaker. Zach is the Senior Advisor to EPA's Assistant Administrator for the Office of Water. Zach will be followed by ICPRB Commissioner Dr. Kimberly Jones. Dr. Jones is the Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs and Professor, Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Howard University. I would like to ask all of you to put your questions in the chat. If we have time at the end of session one, I will ask Stephanie Newmer to read a few of the questions as time permits. So what I'd like to do now is to turn the proceedings over to the Vice Chair of ICPRB, Lisa Daniels of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, for a brief introduction.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone. I welcome you to this really stellar group of individuals that will be speaking about PFAS today. Of course, for most of the country, PFAS continue to remain emerging unregulated contaminants. And of course, the research and the science around PFAS does continue. I also think that work, though, has really expanded exponentially just in the last few years. And as the state of Pennsylvania, so I also represent the state of Pennsylvania as the acting Deputy Secretary for the Office of Water Programs. I will be sharing a little later some of the actions and activities that have been going on in Pennsylvania, as well as the other partner states as well, because it's really an emerging issue, and it continues to be an issue that state and local officials and water suppliers are struggling with. So I just want to welcome everybody. I look forward to the conversation today, and I'll go ahead and turn it back to you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Now what I'd like to do is to turn it over to Zachary Schafer, who will give us an update on EPA's PFAS strategic roadmap. I won't read all of his credentials there. You have them in your packet, and we're really excited to have EPA as our keynote speaker today. So Zach, if you are ready, please start when you can.
I am, and can I just do a quick sound check, Michael?
I can hear you.
All right.
Renee, can you hear him?
And I'm just setting up a quick screen share of my PowerPoint. Oh, sorry, Christina, were you planning to share the slides for me? I forget.
Sorry, I was going to, but I wasn't.
Oh, no, actually, that would be great.
Did you want me to? Okay.
If you could pull them up, that'd be wonderful.
Okay.
I'll just try to remember to say next slide. So while you're pulling them up again, good morning. I'm really honored to be here with all of you. My name is Zachary Schafer. I'm, as Michael shared, I'm Senior Advisor to Assistant Administrator Pfos, who oversees the Office of Water here at the U.S. EPA. And in addition to her role as AA for the Office of Water, and my role is supporting her in that capacity, she's also the chair or the co-chair of EPA's Pfas Council, which Administrator Regan formed early last year, and which last fall produced EPA's strategic roadmap to address PFAS. And so that's what I'll be covering here, and look forward to your questions and look forward to this conversation. I'm so glad that the commission and the partnership basin have dedicated time to this. We know that this is, we still call it an emerging contaminant and an emerging issue, but I think we all know it has emerged. It's our understanding of it and how it impacts us and what we're doing about it that's still emerging. But this is, I think, one of the defining issues of our time as environmental professionals and as public health leaders. And so I'm really heartened to see the collaboration and the energy and the attention focused on PFAS at the federal level, not just at EPA, but across the federal government under the Biden-Harris administration's leadership, and as well as at the state level, at the local level, and at the intergovernmental and regional levels as well, because we know that PFAS do not respect state borders or municipal borders or even federal borders. So this is a challenging problem from many different perspectives, and so we are glad to be in this together with all of you and to be supporting each other. So I'm going to run through an overview of the roadmap. If you could go to the next slide. So in this presentation, I'll provide a brief background on PFAS, since I know that most of the audience has some basic familiarity, but we'll go over some of the basics of it just so we all have a common floor of understanding as I go through this. But I also understand that the next presenter will be presenting more on the science and our current understanding of the science of PFAS. So I won't go too deep there. Then we'll talk about our approach and our goals for addressing PFAS using EPA's authorities and resources. We'll talk about the roadmap. We'll spend most of our time talking about the actions that we have committed to in the roadmap and where we are on quite a few of those actions already. And then we'll close with talking a bit about resources in the bipartisan infrastructure law to address PFAS and other emerging contaminants, but in the context of this conversation, particularly PFAS. So next slide. So as I shared, in April 2021, Administrator Regan established the EPA Council on PFAS and charged it to develop a bold, strategic, whole-of-EPA strategy to protect public health and the environment from the impacts of PFAS. And the council is comprised of senior technical and policy leaders from across EPA program offices and regions. The council is co-chaired by my boss, our Assistant Administrator for Water, Pfos, and EPA's Deputy Regional Administrator for Region 1, Deb Zaro. And it's really partly to demonstrate that this is not just a headquarters issue, that we understand that so much of this work and so much of the communication and the challenges on these issues is happening at the local, the state, and the regional level. And so it's really been important to the EPA and to this group of leaders working on our roadmap and our strategy to build that regional and on-the-ground perspective into our work. The council met the administrator's call through the PFAS strategic roadmap, which we released in October 2021. It does several things. It lays out our whole-of-agency approach to tackling PFAS under each of our key environmental programs and authorities. It sets clear timelines for concrete actions from 2021 to 2024 to help hold us accountable. It fills a critical gap in federal leadership, setting a basic floor of federal protection across the country, recognizing that many states have been out there leading on this for many years, but we want to make sure that, as I mentioned, that knowing that this is not an issue that respects state boundaries and that there's a necessary floor of protection that's necessary for every American and every ecosystem, we're trying to fill that gap. It supports states' ongoing efforts to tackle PFAS by increasing our scientific understanding and empowering states with the methods, tools, and technologies to address PFAS. And it builds on the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to restore scientific integrity by making science the foundation of our work. So I'll return to specific commitments in our roadmap in a few minutes. Next slide. So before I go more into the roadmap and our approach, I want to spend a moment talking about PFAS substances and why we are concerned. PFAS captures a large class of synthetic chemicals made by humans that consist of chains of carbon atoms surrounded by fluorine atoms. There are thousands of different kinds of PFAS, some of which have been more widely used and more widely studied than others, and there are a wide variety of chemical structures. As examples, this slide shows the chemical structure of the most widely used and studied chemicals in the PFAS group, PFOA and PFOS. PFAS have been used in homes, businesses, and industry since the 1940s, and they continue to be used. They have many beneficial uses. They've been and are used by a number of industries and found in many consumer products, including stain and water resistance. They play a role in extinguishing fire as part of firefighting foam. Due to their widespread use, PFAS have been detected in soil, water, and air samples across the country and around the world. And surveys conducted by CDC show that most people in the United States have been exposed to PFAS, including measurable levels of certain PFAS in human blood. Most known exposures to PFAS are relatively low, but some can be high, particularly when people are exposed to a concentrated source over long periods of time. And these are a concern to human health due to their known or suspected toxicities. And current scientific research suggests that exposure to higher levels of certain PFAS may lead to adverse health outcomes. The existing scientific research has demonstrated known or suspected toxicity for certain PFAS, most notably for PFOA and PFOS, at very low levels, including potential developmental, liver, immune, and thyroid effects. Research is still ongoing to determine how different levels of exposure to different PFAS can lead to health effects. Some are relatively well understood, many others are not. And I'll describe a bit later some of the work EPA is doing to improve our scientific understanding. And finally, scientific research has shown that PFAS can resist decomposition in the environment and in the human body, and that many of them have unique properties that prevent their complete breakdown in the environment. And so the continued use of PFAS in industrial and consumer applications continues to magnify the PFAS contamination challenge. So this is what's led to them becoming known as forever chemicals colloquially. And one of the important reasons that we're taking steps in our roadmap to leverage our authorities to restrict their entrance into the environment and to review and play a larger role in preventing unintended uses of certain PFAS in commerce. Next slide. Just to go over the PFAS life cycle, because that is very informative of EPA's approach. The diagram on the left shows some of the ways in which PFAS are used and can enter the environment, from discharges from manufacturing facilities to discharges of PFAS containing firefighting foam at airports to the presence of PFAS at wastewater treatment facilities to PFAS applied to agricultural fields as a component of biosolids. Some of these exposure pathways are unique to PFAS or uniquely important in the PFAS context, and PFAS contamination presents unique challenges. So EPA's approach toward PFAS takes this unique set of characteristics into account and is centered around the following principles, which is first to consider the life cycle of PFAS, their unique properties, the ubiquity of their uses, and the multiple pathways for exposure. Second, to get upstream of the problem, that we will bring deeper focus to preventing PFAS from entering the environment in the first place, which is a foundational step to reducing the exposure and potential risks of future PFAS contamination. Third, it's a goal to hold polluters accountable, that we will seek to hold them and other responsible parties accountable for their actions and for PFAS remediation efforts. Fourth, we want to ensure science-based decision-making, that we will continue to invest and increase our investments in scientific research to fill gaps in our understanding of PFAS. And fifth, that we prioritize protection of disadvantaged communities. And so when we're taking action on PFAS, we want to ensure that disadvantaged communities have equitable access to solutions, and that we're taking every opportunity and leveraging all of our resources and authorities to understand where there are disproportionate impacts of PFAS on certain communities. Next slide. So all of those life cycle characteristics inform our approach to produce the three pillars represented here. The actions described in the roadmap each represent important and meaningful steps to safeguard communities in PFAS contamination, and cumulatively these actions will build upon one another and lead to more enduring and protective solutions. So our integrated approach to PFAS is focused on these three goals, which is first, research, to invest in research, development, and innovation to increase our understanding of exposures and toxicities, their human health and ecological effects, and the effective interventions that incorporate the best available science. Second is to restrict, again, how can we get upstream of the problem to prevent them from entering the environment in the first place. And third is remediate, that we want to broaden and accelerate the cleanup of PFAS contamination to protect human health and ecological systems. And these three goals guide each of the actions included in the roadmap, which I'll run through now. So for these actions that I'll walk through this is an overview of high-level actions and timelines included in the strategic roadmap, organized by each of our main program areas, our program offices like water, chemicals, air, research and development, et cetera. The roadmap includes more detail on each of these actions, and I encourage you to review the roadmap for more details and the timelines that we commit to achieving these commitments, and I'll be happy to share that. I can't recall if there's a chat in WebEx, but I'll make sure that the conference organizers share a link to the roadmap with all of you. I'll first cover EPA's actions to restrict PFAS under the programs of EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, who are taking action under the Toxic Substances Control Act and under the Toxics Release Inventory Program. First of all, EPA is working to deepen our understanding of PFAS categories through the National PFAS Testing Strategy, which EPA released last October. The testing strategy is a major step toward the game-changing goal of breaking PFAS into distinct categories to direct our research, amplify the impact of our regulatory action, and accelerate technology and policy solutions to restricting and remediating PFAS. The testing strategy will help us understand and address the impacts of categories of PFAS, including potential hazards to human health and the environment. As many of you are aware, and as I'm sure the conversation will discuss later, there are thousands of PFAS out there, and we know that that regulating them one by one and addressing them one by one is just not going to meet the moment and meet the need. We also know that we can't regulate PFAS as an entire category of all of them, but that's why this work, this testing strategy, and other work being conducted by our Office of Research and Development is so fundamental to us being able to take steps to break them into those groups and categories and take action on multiple PFAS at the same time. So in early June of this year, EPA announced the first in a series of test orders under our national testing strategy that will provide the agency with critical information on more than 2,000 similar PFAS that fall within these categories. The specific test order issued in June focused on a specific chemical, but it will also inform the agency's understanding of the human health effects of 503 additional PFAS with similar structures as detailed in the testing strategy. Second, EPA is working under its TSCA, or Toxic Substances Control Act authorities, to strengthen our oversight over both new and existing PFAS. We're working to ensure a robust review process for new PFAS to ensure that chemicals are safe before they enter commerce. And EPA is working to review existing PFAS under TSCA to ensure that they're being used in ways that do not present concerns and to prevent the resumed production of legacy PFAS or their uses in new ways. Third, we're collecting data and improving reporting on how PFAS are used and released. So under TSCA, we are working on a final rule to better characterize the sources and quantities of manufactured PFAS in the United States, and that's due by the end of this year. And under the Toxics Release Inventory, or TRI, we are working to enhance PFAS reporting by proposing a rule to remove exemptions and exclusions from reporting. We recently sent this proposed rule to OMB for interagency review and look forward to releasing that for public comment later this year. Fourth, EPA is working to establish a PFAS voluntary stewardship program. We expect this to challenge industry to go above and beyond regulatory or compliance requirements to reduce overall releases of PFAS into the environment. And finally, EPA is working to reduce the presence of PFAS in products purchased by the federal government Last December, as some of you may be aware, President Biden signed an executive order to reestablish the federal government as a leader in sustainability. A critical element of that EO is to promote sustainable acquisition and procurement, which includes prioritizing the purchase of products without added PFAS. So we're working with CEQ and other agencies to do that, using eco labels and other tools to reduce the federal government's procurement of products containing PFAS. And EPA plays a leadership role in that effort. All right, if we could go to the next slide. So the majority of the actions that we are taking under the Pfas Roadmap are housed under the Office of Water, although this is very much a cross-agency partnership. So we're leveraging our authorities under both the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act. And under the Safe Drinking Water Act, EPA is taking a groundbreaking step later this year to set or to propose enforceable limits for PFOA and PFOS in drinking water. So by the end of 2022, we plan to propose a rule that would set enforceable limits for these two PFAS, require monitoring of public water supplies, and we would also evaluate additional PFAS and groups of PFAS for potential future regulation. We know that the public has been calling for these standards for years, and EPA is taking this action as quickly as possible and in advance of our statutory deadline to do so. In support of our rulemaking, EPA Science Advisory Board recently completed its review of updated draft science on the health effects of PFOA and PFOS, and that draft science indicates that negative health effects may occur at much lower levels of exposure to PFOA and PFOS than previously understood, and that PFOA is a likely carcinogen. EPA will carefully evaluate the final SAB report and incorporate those recommendations into EPA's updated analyses that will accompany our proposed maximum contaminant level goal and the enforceable maximum contaminant level in our drinking water regulation later this year. Also for drinking water, EPA is working to improve drinking water data through monitoring, toxicity assessments, and health advisories. With respect to monitoring, EPA in December 2021 finalized the 5th Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, or UCMR5, which will test for 29 PFAS beginning in 2023 and going through 2025 in significantly more drinking water systems nationwide than ever before. Through this rule, we're taking important steps to monitor drinking water in communities across the country, requiring testing for 29 PFAS in more drinking water systems than we have in previous cycles of UCMR. And you may remember that an earlier round of EPA monitoring from 2013 to 2015 helped us discover PFAS contamination and led to significant state and local actions to safeguard our drinking water. With our latest rule, we're taking this a step further. We'll be testing nearly 5 times more PFAS at significantly more water systems and using methods that can detect PFAS at much lower levels than in previous years. And one critical component of this is that we are providing funding to cover the costs of testing for smaller systems under 10,000 customers, so that we really are getting a much more comprehensive and granular understanding of the scope and scale of PFAS contamination. And that in particular is an important example of how EPA is seeking to better understand how communities may be exposed to PFAS in their drinking water, in particular disadvantaged communities, so that we can ensure that low-income communities and communities of color benefit equitably from policy solutions, and that we truly understand where there are environmental justice concerns associated with PFAS. On June 15th, EPA released 4 health advisories. These are interim health advisories for PFOA and PFOS, and final health advisories for PFBS and for Gen X chemicals. Drinking water health advisories provide information on contaminants that can cause health effects and are known or anticipated to occur in drinking water. Importantly, these are non-enforceable and non-regulatory documents. They include scientific information on analytical methods and treatment, and on the health effects that we understand based on an extensive scientific literature review. These new health advisories represent a key data point for EPA, states, and water utilities to inform decisions on water quality monitoring, on optimizing existing technologies that reduce PFAS, and on new investments in controls and regulatory approaches. Looking ahead, as I described earlier, EPA remains committed to proposing an enforceable national primary drinking water regulation by the end of this year and finalizing that rule by the end of 2023. Now, under the Clean Water Act, EPA is working to develop discharge limits for industries that use PFAS through our Effluent Limitations Guidelines program. We're working to proactively establish these national technology-based regulatory limits, including progress on the 9 industrial categories in the proposed PFAS Action Act of 2021. We're also leveraging Clean Water Act authorities in our permitting, analytical methods, water quality criteria, and fish advisories programs. And in particular, with respect to Clean Water Act permitting, we're working to leverage our National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permitting program, to improve monitoring and to reduce PFAS discharges to waterways. This is a really important step to reducing to understanding where PFAS are coming from, and particularly where they're entering wastewater treatment systems, so that we can really get upstream of the problem and ensure that that both influent and effluent to wastewater treatment systems that we're working to reduce the presence of PFAS there and hopefully eliminate the presence of PFAS there. So we're really trying to leverage many different tools in a coordinated fashion, ELGs, our NPDES permitting program, and other tools to get upstream of the problem and get to PFAS at their source. In late April, EPA issued a guidance memo to our regional office on how to address PFAS discharges in EPA-issued NPDES permits and in pre-treatment programs where EPA is the control authority. This will enable EPA to proactively use our permitting authorities to reduce those discharges and obtain more comprehensive monitoring information on potential sources. We are currently working on additional permitting guidance that will focus on the much more broad group of state permitting authorities, with our recommendations to use the same authorities to conduct monitoring and address pre-treatment and leverage pre-treatment control authorities there. We're also working on improved analytical methods to measure more PFAS in more types of environmental media. We in April released draft aquatic life water quality criteria for public comment for PFOA and PFOS, which reflects the latest peer-reviewed scientific knowledge regarding the tox effects of PFOA and PFOS on freshwater aquatic organisms. And we're working to enhance data availability on PFAS and fish tissue to help states and tribes set PFAS fish advisories. And finally, we understand the importance of the biosolids issue and the intersection of PFAS with biosolids, and we are working to evaluate the risks of PFAS and biosolids. We'll be working to finalize a risk assessment for PFOA and PFOS that will serve as the basis for determining whether additional regulation of PFOA and PFOS and biosolids is appropriate. And we're working with our counterparts and colleagues at USDA, FDA, and other agencies on the biosolids issue as well. And know that there will be more conversations about this with colleagues at the state and local levels moving forward as well. Next slide. So here I'm going to address some of our key commitments and efforts in the roadmap to remediate PFAS and the steps we're taking under CERCLA or Superfund and under RCRA. In the roadmap, we are finally committing to develop regulations to designate PFAS as CERCLA hazardous substances. On Tuesday, September 6th, EPA published in the Federal Register a proposed rule to designate PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under CERCLA or Superfund. This rulemaking would increase transparency around releases of these harmful chemicals to help hold polluters accountable for cleaning up their contamination. If finalized, this rule would require facilities across the country to report on PFOA and PFOS releases that meet or exceed the reportable quantity assigned to these substances, which in the proposed rule is 1 pound over a 24-hour period. It would also enhance the ability of federal, tribal nations, state, and local authorities to obtain information regarding the location and extent of releases. It would enhance the ability of EPA and other agencies to respond to release or threats of releases, and would help establish national consistency in the evaluation and cleanup of PFOA and PFOS and encourage better waste management practices. We are committed to using enforcement discretion and other approaches to ensure fairness for minor parties who may have been inadvertently impacted by contamination. And we are committed to doing further outreach and engagement to hear from impacted communities, wastewater utilities, businesses, farmers, and other parties during the consideration of the proposed rule. And we are accepting public comments on the proposed rule during a 60-day public comment period. As a subsequent step, EPA also anticipates issuing an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking after the close of comment on the currently proposed rule to seek comment on designating other PFAS chemicals as CERCLA hazardous substances. So please keep an eye out for that ANPRM. A new action we announced last October, and which was not included in the roadmap, is to take regulatory action under RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Remediation Act, responding to a petition from the governor of New Mexico. First of all, EPA will initiate the process to propose adding 4 PFAS as RCRA hazardous constituents under Appendix 8 of RCRA. It's PFOA, PFOS, PFBS, and Gen X. If completed, this action would make these PFAS subject to RCRA corrective action requirements and would be a key step toward listing them as hazardous wastes. Second, EPA will initiate a separate rulemaking proposal to clarify that the RCRA corrective action program has the authority to require investigation and cleanup for wastes that meet the statutory definition of a hazardous waste. This modification would make clear that emerging contaminants such as PFAS can be cleaned up through the RCRA corrective action process. EPA is also taking significant steps toward updating our research and guidance on PFAS destruction and disposal. We issued interim guidance in December 2020, and in that document, we highlighted significant uncertainties about the effectiveness of some PFAS destruction and disposal technologies. Our scientists are working to improve our understanding of these technologies, and we plan to update the 2020 guidance to reflect both public comments and these newly published research results. And we have a deadline in the roadmap to update that December 2020 guidance by December 2023. We are also taking steps toward restricting PFAS by building the technical foundation for potential Clean Air Act regulation. So right now we are working to identify sources, to develop monitoring approaches and information on mitigation technologies, to increase our understanding of the fate and the transport of PFAS air emissions. And all of that work will help support further decisions on whether to designate PFAS as hazardous air pollutants under the Clean Air Act. Next slide. Research is the foundation of EPA's work on PFAS, and the strategic roadmap includes several actions for our Office of Research and Development as we improve our scientific understanding of PFAS. First, to develop and validate methods to detect and measure PFAS in the environment, including additional targeted methods for detecting and measuring specific PFAS, non-targeted methods for identifying unknown PFAS in the environment, and exploring total PFAS methods, which will help us screen environmental samples for PFAS. And toward this goal, on April 28th, EPA published a new draft method to measure for adsorbable organic fluorine in water samples. This new method, known as Draft EPA Method 1621, can broadly screen for the presence of chemical substances that contain carbon-fluorine bonds, including PFAS. Second, to develop and to advance the science to assess human health and environmental risks from PFAS, our scientists are developing human health toxicity assessments under our IRIS, or Integrated Risk Information System program. We are compiling and summarizing available and relevant scientific information, identifying PFAS sources and transport and exposure pathways, and characterizing how exposure to PFAS may contribute to cumulative impacts on people and communities. And finally, we commit to evaluating, developing technologies for reducing PFAS in the environment, which is critical to inform decisions and actions on drinking water and wastewater treatment, contaminated site cleanup and remediation, air emissions controls, and very importantly, end-of-life materials management. All right, next slide. The risks posed by PFAS and the complexities of the PFAS life cycle demand that the agency take a whole-of-agency approach and attack the problem from multiple directions. So our roadmap includes a number of actions that cut across our media offices and other program areas. So in the roadmap, EPA committed to engage directly with affected communities, and we are beginning a systematic set of engagement and outreach opportunities in each EPA region to hear how PFAS contamination impacts their lives and livelihoods. And this is building on a recommendation from EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. We expect to have more information to share on this engagement effort in the very near future. We also commit to use enforcement tools to identify and address PFAS releases, and where appropriate, to require actions by responsible parties to limit future releases and to address existing contamination. We are committed to reporting on EPA's progress and to communicate PFAS risks. And to that end, we will be issuing an annual public report on our progress We're currently working on our first annual progress report, which we expect to release around the 1-year anniversary of our roadmap this October. We also commit to educating the public about the risks of PFAS to help the public understand what PFAS are, how they are used, and how they can impact their health. And we're embarking now on a critical risk communications effort around drinking water, around biosolids, and around other issues. So please look for more information on that in the near future. And finally, EPA is coordinating with our federal agency partners on policy strategies. Concurrently with the release of the PFAS roadmap by EPA, the White House announced additional coordinated action to advance critical progress on PFAS across the federal family. Through these efforts, EPA and its partners are advancing priority efforts on research, analytical methods, contaminated site cleanup, and other areas. For example, as I mentioned earlier, in December, President Biden signed Executive Order 14057 to reestablish the federal government as a leader in sustainability. EPA is also collaborating with agencies such as the Department of Defense on analytical methods, with the Department of Health and Human Services on assessing PFAS human health risks, and the Department of Agriculture on PFAS in the food system. Next slide. Now, finally, I just want to talk a bit about resources. So as most of you are likely aware, the bipartisan infrastructure law signed by President Biden last November provides the single largest investment in clean water and drinking water that the federal government has ever made. The bill will build on the research, restriction, and remediation call in the Pfas Roadmap in particular by providing $10 billion for communities impacted by PFAS and other emerging contaminants. The bill builds on 3 of EPA's existing water finance programs, but focuses them specifically on PFAS and emerging contaminants. It provides all $10 billion of these funds without state match requirements and as grants or principal forgiveness loans. Of the $10 billion, $4 billion will flow through the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, $1 billion through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, and $5 billion through a new program similar to our WIN grant program, but still a new program to address emerging contaminants in small or disadvantaged communities. With the SRF funds, states will will create intended use plans and submit those plans to EPA for review, just through the same process they do for their annual and supplemental SRF funds. But these are funds dedicated just to action on PFAS. Of course, the supplemental and base SRF funds in the drinking water and clean water can also be used to address PFAS as well. So we are committed to maximizing the impact of these funds and addressing urgent water challenges facing communities, and are thrilled that these funds will enable communities to invest in PFAS treatment solutions while EPA continues to take action to research, restrict, and remediate PFAS under the roadmap. So with that, I will conclude, and I can stay and take questions for a little while longer. Oh, thank you for sharing the roadmap.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Zach, for your informative overview of the issue. I understand that you need to sign off early, so we'll have a question and answer session with you now, if that's okay with you.
Yes, that'd be great. Yeah, I can stick around till just about 10 o'clock.
Okay, excellent. So just want to remind folks to submit your questions in the chat box for Zach, and we'll address them one by one until we need to cut the session off. So Stephanie, do we have questions in the chat box for Zach?
Yes, we do. We have a couple. Our first question is, has there been an evaluation as to whether the CERCLA requirements would impact municipal solid waste disposal?
So this is a really important issue, and one that we have so the proposed CERCLA hazardous substance designation is out for public comment now, and both our Office of Land and Emergency Management and our Office of Enforcement and Compliance Accountability, are looking for public comments on this issue from the municipal wastewater sector, from the agricultural sector, from all of the sectors that may be impacted by this. One thing that they've also made clear, which I mentioned, is that the EPA is looking at how to use its enforcement discretion to ensure fair treatment of minor contributors, particularly those who have inadvertently been exposed to PFAS and passed that exposure along, such as municipal wastewater systems. And so this is an area that we know that we need further information and conversation on, and one that EPA looks forward to commenting or to addressing in it through the comments and through the proposed rule and working toward the final rule.
Awesome. Thank you. We have another question, and that is there a way that the public can be notified when the proposed PFOA and PFOS maximum contaminant level and maximum level contaminant goal are released for public comment?
Absolutely. So, we regularly publish these proposed rules far and wide, and so that we've committed to publishing the proposed rule by the end of this calendar year. So, please keep an eye out. But we don't want to hide this, and this won't be a. We will make sure that there is robust engagement with our state partners through organizations like ECOS, ASDWA, ACWA, ASTWMO, and ASHTO, and then with our water sector partners, American Water Works Association and AMWA and others, but and also with the advocacy, environmental justice, and other communities, so that we're sure to spread this far and wide, because we do look forward to and really want comments on the proposed rule from all stakeholder groups. So yes, it will be shared, and we can certainly make sure that we share it with this group for further distribution.
Thank you. Another question is, what is the timeline for fish tissue advisory levels?
So that is expected this calendar year. I would have to follow up on the specific timelines, but I can certainly get back if you want to connect me with the person asking.
I will be sure to and make sure we make those connections. Another question we have is that how did EPA anticipate utilities to respond to consumers if there does not exist technology to measure this concentration currently?
So we understand that this is a difficult messaging challenge for consumers, for utilities, for states. This isn't the only contaminant or the first contaminant that we've had this challenge with, where the potentially hazardous level of exposure is below detectable limits. And I assume that the question is referring to the health advisory levels that we published for 4 PFAS back in June, which again are non-regulatory, non-enforceable, but we know are informing the public and informing decision makers, and the scientific foundations and basis for those health advisories is also, of course, informing the development of our proposed rule, which will for the drinking water standard, which we'll put out. So we have a range of frequently asked questions on our website to support answering many of those questions, and we're working on additional risk communications as part of our process to roll out the proposed rule later this year. I think one of the things to communicate to customers is that that these are lifetime drinking water lifetime drinking water advisories. This is not a critical or short-term health advisory. I know that that's a nuance, but I think it's an important nuance to communicate that that these are values based on consumption of water over a person's lifetime. It also is just a drinking water health advisory. And one of the things that we've done in the advisories is to build an additional layer of protection in factoring in other potential exposure pathways. So again, that's something that it's a nuance, but it's something that we do think is important to communicate. And there's a start to that in our fact sheet for the public and our fact sheet for water systems, which are available on our health advisories website, and which we'll be providing additional materials on based on our development of risk comms this fall and winter.
And I'd like to, one more question then, Stephanie.
Awesome. So our last question is asking if you could provide a little more information on anticipated timelines for contaminated site investigations and remediation efforts as multiple EPA goals become addressed. What other milestones is EPA looking at to complete beforehand?
So this is something that'll happen on an ongoing basis. Certainly actions that we're taking, to just the second part of the question first, what other milestones is EPA looking to complete beforehand? We don't have to wait to take certain actions. We have authorities to address emergency situations, and EPA will leverage and exercise those authorities as situations demand. There are critical actions that we are taking under the roadmap, and some that we've taken outside of the commitments that are published in the roadmap. For instance, the circular hazardous substance designation is a critical step toward that. That will enable a more systematic foundation to address contamination and remediation efforts. There's also the RCRA action that I mentioned, which we're working through now. We also, earlier this year, our Office of Land and Emergency Management published updated RSL and RML tables to reflect lower values. Those are based on CDC ATSDR health values to inform remediation and cleanup efforts. So those are some of the actions that we've been taking or are taking that are the part of the effort to give the agency additional strength in addressing PFAS remediation and to provide a more comprehensive and systematic approach to that. But I don't have any information on specific timelines for site investigations and remediation efforts.
Well, thank you very much, Zach, for answering the questions. And we've received a bunch of other questions, and I have a question for Stephanie or Renee. Can we, and for you, Zach, can we send those questions along to you for a response afterwards that we can share with the group?
Sure, please do.
Okay, we will do so then. We really do appreciate all your time here today, Zach, and you really covered the waterfront in a very quick time frame. So we put the roadmap in our chat box for those who want to learn more, and we want to wish you well in this effort. So thank you very much, Zach.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be in front of this group. This is, I know, an issue that affects this region very much, and appreciate the partnership from the states and the region, and look forward to working with you as we all take action together.
Okay. What I'd like to do now is to turn the proceedings over to Professor Kimberly Jones for a discussion of PFAS and environmental justice. You see her bio there. She is a commissioner of ICPRB and has been taking the lead for our agency on developing strategies for implementing the environmental justice standards of the Biden administration. So, Kimberly, I'd like to turn it over to you now. Are you muted? I think you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
I do that all the time. All right, so do you see my slides or my notes? I always have to check.
I can see the slide.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you for allowing me to come in and address this group today. I really appreciate the opportunity. As a member of the ICPRB, I do know that the commitment to environmental justice is real. And just as a point of just to explain how I got into this space, I'm a longtime environmental engineer. I've been doing research in water treatment for many years, and over the last maybe 10 years or so, I began to really think a little bit more deeply about kind of the intersection of science, technology, environmental justice, and really begun to think about and really believe that you cannot, in cases like PFAS, thinking about water quality and all those issues, you really have to consider environmental justice and environmental equity in all aspects. As you think about the research, as you think about ways to remediate, as you think about technologies that are appropriate for removing these contaminants, it's very important to do all of this through a lens of environmental justice and environmental equity. And so today, what I want to talk about, I have limited time, even more limited because I think we went a little over previous section, but I think I can make up some time. I want to focus on the environmental equity piece and talk about how the PFAS community can ensure they're considering environmental justice and equity. So first, I wanted to define kind of what for environmental justice. The federal government has a definition. There are other definitions. I'll just be clear. If you look up environmental justice, different communities may have slightly different definitions, but this one is the definition as widely adopted in the federal government. So it's the one I'm choosing to share. And it's a fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people with respect to development, implementation, enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And in a previous presentation by Zachary, he did mention in a roadmap, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, the commitment to community engagement. And just historically, environmental justice has emerged as a response to increase awareness of environmental racism. And I have here on this slide just kind of a history of environmental justice. I think this top picture in black and white shows community protesters. That was a protest in Warren County, North Carolina in 1982, where residents were protesting a hazardous landfill that was slated to be placed in their community. More than 500 people were arrested, and it was really the first arrest in U.S. history over the siting of a landfill. And unfortunately, the people in Warren County lost that battle. The toxic waste site was deposited in their neighborhood. But the upside of that story is that it really drew the nation's attention to this issue around environmental justice. It got media attention. People began to really think about this issue. And it really marked a milestone in a national movement around environmental justice. The bottom picture shows a more recent case that has come to light. It's a company had a coal ash spill where almost 40,000 tons of toxic coal ash was leaked into a river, and it really impacted residents many miles down the river, and it created an emergency. And again, highlighted just this case or issues about how these incidents may affect communities. And so when we think about these things, environmental justice, environmental equity, I tend to use the words interchangeably, but they are a little bit different. Environmental justice really works to remove systemic barriers that cause inequities. And when you think about environmental equity, that's providing the appropriate support to remove or reduce these environmental disparities. And that also may include addressing the systemic barriers that environmental justice focuses on. So I tend to use equity more because as a researcher, as a scientist, I really think more about how we can enable technologies to really remove those systemic barriers to reduce the disparities. So I use both, but I will probably say environmental equity a little bit more than environmental justice, but I wanted to define they're very closely related. So again, thinking about these disproportionate effects, I was thinking about that spill that I mentioned earlier. You know, when you think about that one case, and that may be something that's in the paper and people read about it, but it really is more widespread. I think EPA estimates about 1.5 million people of color living in catchment areas of coal ash surface impoundment. So it's a very widespread problem. And there are solutions, scientific, technical solutions to the problem. This picture on the right shows a lined landfill that can help reduce spills. But often once the damage is done, the community doesn't necessarily hear about the technology that's been implemented to reduce that. What happens is you lose trust. The community loses trust. And a lot of times that's really hard to recover from. Another example is in Flint. Many of you probably heard about the issues around lead in Flint. I just wanted to kind of focus again on this issue about trust and science and technology and how that's related. Where we are now, where they are now with Flint, they have data scientists that came up with a very interactive map. This map on your upper left shows residents can go in and they can see their neighborhood, they can see where they live, and they can actually track the progress for replacing the lead service lines in Flint. This middle picture shows a worker actively working to replace some of those lead service lines. But then on the right, this is recent because this is since the pandemic, these residents have en masse. They are still using bottled water in a lot of neighborhoods. And some of that is because there's a lack of trust that's been really hard to regain. And so often when these problems happen, it creates long-term negative impacts throughout the community. And just kind of looking more broadly across our country, the concerns over these environmental inequities are increasing. This map just kind of breaks out the United States into broad areas, and I just will highlight some issues where we know there are concerns. So what I will highlight aren't all the issues, is not an exhaustive list of issues in these areas, but these are issues that have shown to have a disproportionate effect for vulnerable communities. You see in the Southwest, there are issues around nitrates and arsenic in the San Joaquin Valley, particularly for Hispanic households. You see issues in South Central part of the United States, nitrates, and large, and particularly in Texas, huge percentages of those communities in low-income communities are unpiped communities. They don't have piped water. They depend solely on bottled water in some cases. The Southeast part of the United States, they have issues, particularly for vulnerable communities with coal ash, as I mentioned also, and Pfos, the topic of today's conversation. In the Midwest United States, again, large percentages of communities that are not piped, also issues around lead, which have been mentioned before. Northeastern part of the United States, issues around lead, coal ash, and Pfos. That's why we're here today. North Central part of the United States, again, Pfos is an issue, mining waste in vulnerable communities. And in Northwest United States, issues around arsenic and bacteria. And so these are all issues. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but these are examples of some issues that exist and are disproportionate, where there's a disproportionate burden on vulnerable communities. And I just left a meeting at National Science Foundation over the earlier part of this week, where we were talking about this increased interest and a response from the research community attempting to address these issues. So one of the program directors that I work closely with did an analysis and this goes back to 1998. So this is a very broad analysis of proposals or awarded proposals that include terms environmental equity or environmental justice, environmental inequality, environmental sacrifice, or environmental inequity. So it's a lot of terms, but just to kind of see how researchers are responding to this issue. And again, National Science Foundation, they fund science. So what we see here is an increase in scientific proposals that also include issues around environmental justice or environmental equity. And you see here that the percentage has really increased after 2020. So that represents partially, and there are a lot of things that happened in our country in 2020, and it really brought to light a greater appreciation, a greater interest and knowledge about some of these inequities. So the number of proposals has really increased. I did ask him to look at proposals that included Pfos and environmental equity or environmental justice. That number is really small now, but I anticipate it should increase. And what I will talk to you today is to hopefully encourage the Pfos community to really begin to think about issues around justice and equity at the onset, as you're really grappling with some of the data and science behind research, behind remediating Pfos. So again, I want to just say here that justice and equity do belong in environmental research. It can be a focus or critical element of the research. You also can think about equity of the research team, really how your group really performs its work. Is the team diverse? is the team, including members from other communities as they do their work. I want to highlight an example from New York. The climate community has been very, very active in ensuring that equity is integrated in environmental research. And just I chair an advisory committee on environmental research and education at NSF. That's kind of where some of our conversations have been. So I will say some of these slides were shown in our committee over the last couple of days to really highlight the importance of including issues around equity in the research. And so just to understand what that means, we need kind of a guiding framework for how we think about equity. And in this case, we thought it was discussed in this example about climate issues in New York in 3 dimensions. We have distributive equity, where we emphasize disparities across social groups, neighborhoods, vulnerable communities, and to really think about the outcomes of our technical actions or adaptation actions in that community. We can also think about procedural equity, where we emphasize the extent and robustness of public and community participation in planning and decision-making. And we heard Zachary's presentation. He did say that the EPA plans to engage communities in some of their decision-making. And then we have contextual equity, where we emphasize social, economic, and political factors and processes that contribute to uneven vulnerability and that shape capacity issues. And those can be maybe some economic issues, workforce development, and things like that. This map here really shows where they defined a social vulnerability index when they were thinking about how to address climate issues in the state of New York. And so the water and climate community has really been thinking hard about equity, and this is a New York City panel on climate change that really had this equity discussion. And they talked about a few approaches that work. This collaboration between researchers, city officials, environmental justice communities needs to be real. Co-production means when they come up with solutions or recommendations or they make decisions, it is really co-produced by all members of those communities, not in a unidirectional way where you have researchers or city officials really informing the communities of what the decisions are, but it's really co-produced by those communities. Again, distributive equity, how to track vulnerability at the community level, and how do you incorporate feedback from the community and community perspectives in your planning. And so this panel had many recommendations. I just pulled a few out here that I thought were especially relevant as we think about this Pfas, our roadmap for Pfas. And some of those are, to really work side by side. The research community should be working really side by side with communities at the onset. I do think relative to work we've done in water quality writ large and work that's been done on climate, the work that we're doing in Pfas, and we are really actively, seeking, looking at data sets, thinking about how we can find out more about Pfas contamination. And so it's a really nice time to begin to work with communities actively to really think about projects that would help meet those goals. And also thinking about a racial equity rubric to use to evaluate the work. Was a specific recommendation that they had. And then that work groups consider equity in all their internal practices, work plans, and development. So equity is really integral part of what they're doing. So what does this have to do with Pfas? I knew Zachary would precede me today. And so I just have here 2 key points from that roadmap that include, so in the research section and in the remediation section, we see that they call out specifically environmental justice concerns. So they talk about the efforts to reduce the cumulative burden on environmental justice or environmental vulnerable communities and to address environmental justice concerns. And so I really want to just highlight that and dig a little bit more deeply into how that might be done. So we know exposure to PFAS is not evenly distributed, right? We have our EJ screen that's often used to kind of define or screen communities that may need more attention in their, different environmental indicators that can be used for the EJ screening. And we know how PFAS is some of the main exposure routes. We know it can be exposure in a workplace, ingesting food, drinking water, exposure from consumer products. And I think it was mentioned earlier that when we think about setting a policy around PFAS exposure or maximum contaminant levels for drinking water, you do have to really understand the different routes of exposure. And you also really need to understand how those routes of exposure may differ for some vulnerable communities.
Commissioner Jones, 2-minute warning.
Oh, gosh. Okay. I only have a couple more slides. Thank you. So the impact, I lost 5 minutes, Michael. I did start 5 minutes late, but I'm gonna try to make it up.
Well,
The impact on vulnerable communities. We know that low income and households with people of color are more likely to experience food insecurity, have less access to fresh and nutritional foods. They rely more on processed foods. So we need to really focus on some of those communities when we think about, I'm gonna just jump to this because this is a good slide that I want to be cut off before I can focus on this. But out in California, they are beginning to identify vulnerable communities with PFAS contamination. There are data gaps. So the point here is they're screening. We can learn from other places where they have screens specifically for PFAS contamination and impact on vulnerable communities. But this map on the left here, all those gray areas are places where there's no data. And they really need to get to work hard on addressing those data gaps. The other areas you can see here, I won't have time to go into it, but mainly the dark green areas show communities where there are high PFAS concentrations or exposure, and also high percentage of high vulnerable communities. This map on the right is an interactive tool that they have developed where communities can go on and actually understand what the PFAS results are in their community. We do need partnerships. I'm going to skip this because I don't have a lot of time. We can think about framework for partnerships. And as we develop those partnerships, there's a group from University of Michigan that have really been thinking hard about kind of developing these framework for partnerships in order to make sure that that these partnerships are productive. So with that, I will end on my last slide, where I will say community engagement is really key to effective research and remediation efforts for PFAS. And so as we address these data gaps, which I think are key, we really have to consider EJ communities, partner with the communities when we discuss solutions, and integrate equity into core science and research activities. So thank you very much. I think it is right at my end time.
Well, thank you very much for Commissioner Jones for getting us back on schedule. We appreciate that. And we also appreciate all your leadership on this issue at ICPRB. So with that, I'd like to move to session 2.